The morning of March 3rd, 1943, Squadron leader Takeo Okumura of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Tainan Air Group circles his A-6M-0 fighter at 4,000 feet above the Bismarck Sea, northeast of New Guinea. Below him, a vital convoy 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division plows through moderate seas toward Lae. His orders are clear. Protect the convoy at all costs. He's shot down 17 Allied aircraft in the past year. He knows American bombers. He knows their tactics, their weaknesses, their predictable attack patterns. Then he sees them. A formation of B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, approaching from the south at what appears to be impossibly low altitude, perhaps 100 feet above the water. This puzzles him. Medium bombers typically attack from 8 to 10,000 feet. These are coming in at mast height, like torpedo bombers. He radios his flight. 6 Zeros peel off to intercept. Standard doctrine for engaging American medium bombers. Approach from the front quarter where their defensive armament is weakest. Fire a burst into the cockpit and engines. Break away before reaching the tail guns. Okumura has done this dozens of times. His Zero accelerates into a shallow dive, closing the distance. 1,000 meters, 800. The lead B-25 grows larger in his gun sight. It doesn't deviate. It flies straight at him. At 600 meters, he prepares to fire. Then the bomber's nose erupts in light. Not the scattered defensive fire he expects. A solid river of tracers, a visible cone of destruction that seems to fill the entire sky between them. His wingman's Zero, flying 300 meters to his left, disintegrates, simply comes apart in mid-air, pieces tumbling into the sea. Okumura breaks hard right, yanking his stick so violently he grays out momentarily. When his vision clears, the bomber is gone, already past him, and he's alive only because he reacted on pure instinct. He doesn't know it yet, but he's just encountered the weapon that will rewrite the rules of low-altitude air combat. He's met the B-25 Strafer, and nothing in his training prepared him for what he just witnessed. A bomber that attacks like a fighter. A transport aircraft with more forward-firing guns than his entire squadron combined. This is the story of how American innovation transformed a vulnerability into overwhelming firepower, how mechanics in dusty Pacific workshops created a weapon so psychologically devastating that veteran fighter pilots would begin refusing missions rather than face it. This is the story of the aircraft that forgot it was supposed to be prey. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how this happened, we must go back 14 months to the beginning of 1942, when the B-25 Mitchell was dying in combat, not from design flaws but from doctrinal misapplication. The North American B-25 Mitchell entered service in 1941 as a medium bomber, a designation that defined both its capabilities and its tactical employment. Medium bombers occupied the space between light attack aircraft and heavy strategic bombers. They carried bomb loads between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds, had combat ranges exceeding 1,000 miles, and were designed for horizontal bombing from medium altitudes, typically 8,000 to 12,000 feet. At these altitudes, accuracy suffered, but survival rates improved. Enemy anti-aircraft fire was less effective. Fighter interceptions, while dangerous, gave bomber formations time to organize defensive fire. The B-25's defensive armament reflected this intended role. The B model, which entered combat in early 1942, carried 5 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, one in a manually operated turret atop the fuselage, 2 in a dorsal position behind the cockpit, 2 in the tail. For forward defense, a single 30 caliber machine gun mounted in the nose, operated by the bombardier lying prone in the glazed nose compartment. This was considered adequate. Bombers weren't supposed to fight their way through opposition. They were supposed to fly in formation, use altitude as protection, and rely on fighter escorts when available. Then, the war's reality diverged sharply from peacetime planning. In the Pacific theater, distances were vast. Targets were often ships or coastal installations, and weather frequently made high-altitude bombing ineffective. In North Africa, 12th Air Force B-25 Seconds found themselves tasked with interdiction missions against enemy supply columns, airfields, and harbour facilities. Both theatres demanded low-altitude attack profiles. The problem with low-altitude attack was simple. It exposed bombers to every weapon on the battlefield. Anti-aircraft artillery could track targets easily. Small arms fire became a threat, and fighter interceptions became far more deadly because bombers had no altitude to trade for speed or maneuverability. The B-25's forward armament became a critical liability. Enemy fighters, particularly German Bf-109 Seconds and Japanese Zeros, quickly identified the bomber's vulnerability. Standard interception doctrine evolved. Approach from directly ahead or slightly below, where the bomber could bring only a single 30 caliber gun to bear, fire a sustained burst into the cockpit and engines, and break away. The bombardier, lying prone and exposed behind clear plexiglass with a lightweight machine gun, faced cannon-armed fighters closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The engagement lasted seconds. The bombardier rarely survived long enough to return effective fire. Casualty statistics from early 1942 painted a grim picture. In the Southwest Pacific, B-25 squadrons flying anti-shipping missions reported loss rates, approaching 15% per sortie during certain operations. The 91st Bombardment Squadron, operating from Port Moresby, lost 8 aircraft in 3 weeks during April 1942. The 3rd Bombardment Group, flying missions against Japanese positions in the Philippines and New Guinea, saw similar attrition. Aircraft were being replaced. Crews were harder to replace. Each B-25 carried 6 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier navigator, radio operator, engineer gunner, and tail gunner. Every aircraft lost meant 6 trained airmen killed, captured, or missing. Pilots knew they were flying into a meat grinder. Captain Edward Larner, commanding officer of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, wrote in his after-action report from May 1942, "Current tactics require medium bombers to attack from altitudes where defensive fire from all sources is most effective. The aircraft's forward armament is inadequate to suppress enemy fighters, making head-on passes. Unless modifications are made to armament or tactics, loss rates will remain prohibitive." The problem was recognized at multiple command levels, but institutional inertia was powerful. The B-25 was designed as a medium-altitude horizontal bomber. Modifying its role meant questioning doctrine developed over years of peacetime planning. It meant admitting that the aircraft, as designed, couldn't perform the missions the war demanded. And institutional military structures, particularly in 1942 when the United States was still mobilizing and learning how to fight a global war, resisted rapid doctrinal change. Into this situation stepped a man who had no patience for institutional inertia and every reason to be angry. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, called Pappy by virtually everyone who knew him, was 42 years old in 1942, ancient by combat pilot standards. He'd served in the Navy during World War I, flying seaplanes on anti-submarine patrol. After the war, he left the military and spent 2 decades in the Philippines, first as a civilian pilot, then as operations manager for Philippine Airlines. He married a Filipino woman, Clara Ormilda. They had 4 children. By December 1941, Gunn had built a comfortable life in Manila, a good job, a family he loved, roots deep in the islands. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines destroyed that life in hours. Gunn managed to evacuate to Australia on one of the last flights out of Manila before the city fell. His wife and children didn't make it out. They were trapped in Manila when the Japanese occupied the city. For months, Gunn had no information about whether they were alive or dead. Eventually, he learned they'd been interned at Santo Tomas internment camp, one of several camps the Japanese established for Allied civilians. They were alive, but they were prisoners, and Gunn could do nothing to help them. He channeled his rage into the war. The Army Air Forces, desperate for Terryot, experienced pilots, commissioned him as a captain and later promoted him to major. Gunn flew combat missions in anything available: B-25 Seconds, B-26 Marauders, even A-20 Havocs. He was fearless to the point of recklessness, pressing attacks long after other pilots would have broken off. But his real contribution wasn't in the cockpit. It was in the workshops and hangars of Townsville and Port Moresby, where he began experimenting with modifications that would fundamentally change air combat in the Southwest Pacific. Gunn's background was crucial. He wasn't just a pilot. He'd spent 20 years keeping civilian aircraft operational on minimal budgets in remote locations. He understood airframes, weight distribution, stress limits, and improvisation. He looked at problems differently than officers trained in the conventional Army Air Forces system. When he saw B-25 Seconds getting slaughtered by frontal attacks, he didn't write reports recommending tactical changes or requesting better fighter escort. He went to the machine shops and started cutting up bombers. The concept was simple, almost obvious in retrospect. If bombers were vulnerable to frontal attack, they would make the front dangerous. Instead of defending against attacking fighters, attack them first. Transform the bomber's greatest weakness into overwhelming offensive firepower. But implementation required solving multiple technical problems. The B-25's nose was a bombardier's station, a glazed compartment designed for visibility, not structural strength. It couldn't support heavy weapons. Mounting guns there would require removing the bombardier's position entirely, which meant losing the ability to perform traditional level bombing. It would change the aircraft's center of gravity. It would add significant weight, and it would require finding space for thousands of rounds of ammunition. Gunn began with available resources. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun was the Army Air Force's standard defensive weapon. It fired a heavy bullet at high velocity, approximately 2,900 feet per second muzzle velocity. The 50 caliber round could penetrate aircraft armor at combat ranges. It could damage engines, and it was already in the supply system, with spare guns available from damaged aircraft and ammunition production already established. Gunn's first modification, completed in early 1943, involved mounting 4 50 caliber guns in the nose of a B-25C. The process was crude but effective. Mechanics removed the glazed bombardier's nose entirely, fabricating a solid metal nose cap from the aluminum sheet. They mounted 4 M2 Browning guns in the nose, arranged in a rectangular pattern, all pointed forward and bore-sighted, to converge at 300 yards. They fabricated ammunition boxes that fit in the available space, feeding belts to the guns. The initial test installation added approximately 600 pounds to the aircraft's nose. 4 guns at 64 pounds each, plus mounting hardware, plus 1,500 rounds of ammunition at approximately 100 rounds per gun. The first test flight nearly ended in disaster. The pilot, whose name is lost to history, but whose experience was recorded in maintenance logs, reported that the aircraft wanted to nose down during takeoff. The forward center of gravity made the bomber nose-heavy, requiring constant back pressure on the control yoke. During flight, handling characteristics changed. The aircraft felt sluggish in pitch, and when the pilot test-fired the guns at altitude, the recoil was violent enough to slow the aircraft noticeably and create a pronounced nose-down pitch moment. Gunn returned to the drawing board. He repositioned the guns slightly aft within the nose section, improving the center of gravity. He reduced the ammunition load from 1,500 to 1,200 rounds, saving weight. He consulted with other pilots and mechanics, refining the installation. By February 1943, the modifications were proven enough for combat testing. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, approved limited deployment of modified aircraft. The first combat test came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the convoy operation that opened this narrative. Intelligence had identified a major Japanese convoy departing Rabaul on February 28, 1943, bound for Lae in New Guinea. The convoy carried the 51st Division's main strength, approximately 6,900 soldiers plus equipment and supplies. Losing this convoy would cripple Japanese defensive capabilities in New Guinea. Allied air forces prepared a maximum effort. The plan involved multiple attack waves over several days, combining high-altitude bombing by B-17 flying fortresses, medium-altitude attack by conventional B-25 seconds, and low-altitude masthead bombing by modified Strafer B-25 seconds using a new tactic Gunn had developed: skip bombing. Skip bombing was conceptually simple but technically demanding. Aircraft approached the target at extremely low altitude, 50 to 100 feet above the water at high speed. At ranges between 250 to 400 yards from the target ship, the pilot released bombs with a delayed fuse. The bombs, traveling at the aircraft's forward speed, skipped across the water surface like a stone, struck the ship's hull at or below the waterline where armor was thinnest, and detonated seconds later inside the hull. The tactic was devastatingly effective against ships, but required pilots to fly straight and level at point-blank range, while ship-based anti-aircraft guns fired directly at them. This was where the Strafer's heavy forward armament proved its value. The modified B-25 seconds approached their targets with all 4 nose guns firing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before the ship's gunners could bring effective fire to bear. 4 50 caliber guns, firing in unison at 800 rounds per minute each, created a cone of fire containing over 50 bullets per second. Tracers every 5th round, loaded with a pyrotechnic compound that burned brightly, created visible streams of fire that had a profound psychological impact on enemy gunners. Men manning anti-aircraft positions, seeing a solid wall of tracers approaching, often abandoned their guns or fired wildly without aiming. Those who remained at their posts were frequently killed before they could effectively engage the attacking bomber. The attack on March 3rd was methodical and brutal. B-17 seconds attacked first from high altitude, achieving few hits but forcing the convoy to scatter defensive formation. Then the B-25 seconds came in at low level. 8 modified Strafers led the attack, approaching at wave-top height at speeds approaching 250 miles per hour. The lead bomber, piloted by Captain Lana, the same officer who'd written pessimistically about bomber vulnerability 2 months earlier, selected a transport ship as his target. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire with all 4 nose guns. The tracer streams walked across the water, then reached the ship's superstructure. Gun positions along the deck went silent. At 300 yards, Lana released his bombs, pulled up sharply, and watched as 2 500-pound bombs skipped across the water, struck the transport's hull, and detonated below the waterline. The ship began listing immediately. 7 more strafers followed in quick succession, each selecting a target, each suppressing defensive fire with overwhelming forward firepower, each delivering skip-bombing attacks at point-blank range. The conventional B-25 seconds, carrying standard bomb loads, attacked from slightly higher altitude. Japanese fighter cover, expected to be the primary threat, proved less dangerous than anticipated. The Zeros that attempted to intercept the Strafers discovered what Okumura had learned. Approaching a B-25 from the front was no longer a safe option. The Strafers didn't defend, they attacked. Pilots fired their nose guns at intercepting fighters, forcing the Zeros to break off or risk flying into concentrated 50-caliber fire. Over 3 days of continuous attack, Allied aircraft sank all 8 transports and 4 of 8 destroyers. Of the 6,900 Japanese soldiers aboard the transports, fewer than 1,000 reached shore. The rest drowned or were killed during the attacks. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the most decisive Allied air victory in the Southwest Pacific to that date, and the modified B-25 Strafers had proven their concept in the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. Japanese military intelligence immediately recognized they'd encountered something new. Interrogation reports from captured aircrew who survived attacks on subsequent convoys contain references to American bombers with cannon-like forward armament and impossible concentration of fire from the nose. Some reports describe the B-25 Strafers as flying battleships, a term that would become common in Japanese tactical assessments. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese fighter pilots, trained to exploit bomber vulnerabilities through frontal attacks, suddenly faced bombers that shot back with firepower exceeding many fighters. The tactical equation had reversed. Bombers were no longer prey. Word of the Strafers' success spread rapidly through the 5th Air Force. Pilots who'd been flying conventional B-25 seconds requested transfers to starter squadrons. Ground crews, seeing the combat footage and hearing pilot accounts, began volunteering for modification duties. General Kenny, impressed by results, ordered an expanded modification program. By May 1943, 5th Air Force maintenance depots were converting dozens of B-25 seconds to starter configuration. But Gunn wasn't satisfied with 4 guns. If 4 guns worked, more would work better. The evolution from 4 guns to what eventually became the most heavily armed production aircraft in the American inventory happened through rapid iteration driven by combat feedback. By mid-1943, Gunn and his teams were installing 6 50-caliber guns in B-25 C and D models, 4 in the nose, 2 in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, then 8 guns, then 10. Each modification required solving new engineering challenges. Weight distribution remained critical. Ammunition storage became increasingly complex. Recoil forces multiplied. The airframe itself had limits. There was only so much weight and structural stress the B-25's design could accommodate before flight characteristics degraded unacceptably. The standardization of these field modifications came with the B-25G model, which entered production in October 1943. North American Aviation, the B-25's manufacturer, incorporated the Strafer concept into a production variant. The G model mounted a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose, the same gun mounted on M3 Grant and early M4 Sherman tanks, along with two .50 caliber machine guns. The concept was to provide bomber crews with anti-shipping capability against armored targets. The 75mm cannon could penetrate light naval armor and could destroy coastal fortifications or hardened ground targets. It fired a 14-pound projectile at 1,800 feet per second muzzle velocity, with an effective range of approximately 1,000 yards. Testing the 75mm installation revealed significant challenges. The gun's recoil, substantially greater than machine gun recoil, required heavy reinforcement of the nose structure. The entire aircraft shuddered when the cannon fired. Accuracy was problematic because the gun was rigidly mounted, aiming required pointing the entire aircraft at the target. The rate of fire was slow, approximately 4 rounds per minute maximum, limited by the need for manual loading, and ammunition capacity was severely restricted. The B-25G could carry only 21 rounds of 75mm ammunition. Crews had to make every shot count. Despite these limitations, the 75mm installation proved effective in specific tactical situations. Against large ships, concrete bunkers, or armored trains, the cannon provided firepower that machine guns couldn't match. Gun camera footage from B-25G operations in the Pacific shows the 75mm rounds impact against Japanese cargo vessels. The shell would strike the hull, penetrate, and detonate inside, often causing catastrophic secondary explosions if the round hit ammunition or fuel storage. But the cannon was situational. For most targets, machine guns were more practical, higher rate of fire, greater ammunition capacity, and sufficient destructive effect against the majority of target strafers engaged. North American Aviation's next production variant, the B-25H, represented the culmination of the Strafer concept. It entered production in July 1944 and mounted the 75mm cannon, plus 14 .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in the nose, 4 in cheek blisters, 2 in the tail turret, 2 in waist positions, and 2 in a dorsal turret. Fully armed and loaded, a B-25H carried over half a ton of ammunition. The forward armament alone, the cannon plus 8 forward-firing .50 calibers, delivered more firepower than many destroyers' secondary batteries. This was no longer a medium bomber. It was a flying weapons platform, designed specifically for ground attack and anti-shipping missions. The psychological impact of encountering a B-25H in combat defied traditional military assessment metrics. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Italy in late 1944 contain accounts that read like exaggerations but are corroborated across multiple independent sources. A report from Panzer Grenadier Regiment 129, operating near Anzio in January 1945, describes an attack by American twin-engine bombers employing direct-fire artillery and simultaneous machine gun bombardment. The report notes that the attack destroyed 3 armored vehicles, killed 14 soldiers, and forced the battalion to abandon a planned counterattack because forward positions came under sustained fire from aircraft-mounted artillery beyond the effective range of anti-aircraft weapons. To understand the shock this caused German forces, context is essential. German soldiers in Italy were veterans. Many had fought on the Eastern Front. They'd experienced Soviet ground attack aircraft, particularly the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, which mounted cannons and rockets. But the Sturmovik was a single-engine, relatively slow aircraft that attacked individually or in small groups. The B-25H attacked in squadron strength 12 to 18 aircraft at once each. mounting firepower equivalent to a light tank, all arriving simultaneously at a single target area. The volume of fire was unprecedented. Staff Sergeant Heinrich Böll, writing in his diary in March 1945 while serving with the Wehrmacht's 26th Panzer Division in northern Italy, recorded his experience of a B-25H attack. The sound comes first engines, many engines, low altitude. Then we see them, perhaps 12 aircraft in loose formation. We take cover. Anti-aircraft guns open fire, but the aircraft do not deviate. They come straight toward our position. Then the firing begins. I cannot adequately describe it. Not machine guns in the sense we understand. This is a continuous roar, like fabric tearing but magnified beyond reason. The ground erupts. Trees shatter. One bomber fires what appears to be a cannon, an actual cannon from its nose. The round strikes an SD, KFZ, 251 half-track 30 meters from my position. The vehicle explodes. The entire attack lasts, perhaps 90 seconds. When it ended, our battalion had lost 9 vehicles and 23 men. We did not inflict any damage on the attackers. Böll survived the war and became a noted German author. His wartime diaries were published in 1972, and this account can be verified against his unit's casualty records. While Strafer operations expanded in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, the concept spread to other air forces and commands. In North Africa, the 12th Air Force began receiving modified B-25 seconds in mid-1943. The desert environment presented different tactical challenges than the Pacific. Targets were more often ground-based airfields, supply depots, vehicle columns, fortified positions. The open terrain meant anti-aircraft defences could be extensive and well-positioned. German flak units in North Africa were experienced and disciplined, having fought the RAF for 2 years before American forces arrived in theatre. The 97th Bombardment Group, operating from Tunisia in summer 1943, converted its B-25 infantry to Strafer configuration and developed tactics specifically for desert operations. Instead of the ultra-low altitude approach used for anti-shipping work, the 97th crews approached targets at 500 to 1,000 feet, fast and from unexpected directions. They'd identify targets using intelligence reports, German fuel dumps, ammunition storage, airfield facilities, then plan approach routes that minimized exposure to known flak positions. The Strafers would come in fast, possibly 260 to 280 miles per hour at low level, firing their nose guns throughout the attack run to suppress ground fire, then exit the target area using terrain masking when possible. Captain Robert Wilkins, flying with the 310th Bombardment Squadron of the 97th Group, described a typical mission in his post-war memoir, published in 1958. We hit a German supply depot near Bizerte in August 43. Intelligence said it contained fuel and ammunition for Rommel's retreating forces. We came in from the north at dawn, sun behind us, 8 aircraft in loose formation. At 2 miles out, I could see the target rows of fuel drums, stacked ammunition crates, several trucks. Flak started immediately, black puffs tracking across the sky, but we were moving fast and jinked slightly to throw off their aim. At half a mile I opened up with all nose guns. The tracers walked across the depot. Fuel drums erupted in flames. Secondary explosions began before we reached the drop point. I released 6 250-pound fragmentation bombs, pulled up sharply right to avoid the explosions, and we were clear. The entire attack, from first tracer to wheels up from the target, maybe 30 seconds. Behind us, the depot was a firestorm. The 97th tactics became doctrine for 12th Air Force Strafer operations. Speed and surprise trumped heavy fighter escort. Small formations attacked multiple targets simultaneously, overwhelming German defensive responses. And the heavy forward armament meant single strafers could suppress ground fire long enough to complete their bomb runs. Loss rates, while never negligible, were substantially lower than conventional medium bomber operations at similar altitudes. The 97th flew 174 combat missions between July 1943 and May 1944, losing 18 aircraft, a loss rate of approximately 10%, high by later war standards but remarkably low given the low-altitude attack profile and heavily defended targets. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. As 1944 progressed and Allied forces advanced into France and Germany, B-25 Strafer squadrons operating from English and French bases found new roles. The 9th Air Force's bombardment groups supported ground forces during the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaign across France. Strafers attacked bridges, rail junctions, German strong points, and vehicle columns. The tactical situation in France differed significantly from North Africa or the Pacific. Germany's Luftwaffe fighter forces, though depleted by attrition over 2 years of combat, remained dangerous. German flak defences were the most sophisticated in the world, employing radar-directed guns and experienced crews, and the close proximity of friendly ground forces meant accurate target identification was critical. Fratricide risk was ever present. The 416th Bombardment Group, flying from bases in France from August 1944 onward, specialized in tactical support for ground forces. Their mission reports, preserved in National Archives records, detail the complexity of close air support in the European theatre. A typical mission might involve a request from ground commanders for strikes against a German position holding up an advance. The 416th would dispatch a flight of 4 to 6 strafers, coordinated with a forward air controller who could see both friendly positions and the target. The strafers would arrive on station, contact the controller, receive target identification, often using smoke markers or distinctive terrain features, and then attack with extreme precision to avoid hitting friendly forces, sometimes only a few hundred yards from the target. First Lieutenant James Keefe, pilot with the 416th, flew 63 combat missions between September 1944 and April 1945. His account, recorded in an oral history interview conducted in 1991, describes the tension of close support missions. You're coming in at 300 feet, doing 250 knots, and you have maybe 5 seconds to positively identify your target before you commit to the attack. Friendly troops are close enough that if you're off by even 100 yards, you're killing Americans or Brits. The pressure is immense. But the Strafers' firepower made us effective. We could put 850 calibers on target with pinpoint accuracy. I've seen us take out a single building in a French village where Germans were holed up, saturate it with fire, and leave the buildings on either side untouched. That kind of precision saved lives our guys on the ground. The final production variant, the B-25J, entered service in December 1943, but continued production through the war's end. It wasn't specifically designed as a Strafer, but many J models were field-modified to carry 12 50 caliber guns, 8 in the nose and forward fuselage, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the tail. The J model represented standardization of lessons learned through 2 years of combat. It was faster than earlier models, better armoured, and its airframe incorporated structural reinforcements that allowed heavy armament without the handling issues that plagued early conversions. By 1945, B-25 Strafers operated in every theatre where American forces fought. In the Philippines, they supported MacArthur's return campaign, attacking Japanese positions throughout the archipelago. In Burma, they flew missions along the Ledo Road and against Japanese supply lines. In China, they supported Chinese nationalist forces fighting Japanese occupation armies. In Italy, they intercepted German supply routes through the Alps. In France and Germany, they ranged ahead of advancing Allied armies, destroying anything that could support German resistance. The Strafer had become ubiquitous, a standard weapon in the American tactical air arsenal. But the human cost remained severe, despite the aircraft's effectiveness. Flying at low altitude against defended targets meant exposure to every weapon the enemy possessed. Anti-aircraft artillery, particularly German 88mm flak guns, remained deadly throughout the war. Small arms fire could damage or destroy a low-flying aircraft. A lucky rifle shot could kill a pilot or sever a control cable. And while the Strafer's heavy armament deterred fighter attacks, determined or desperate enemy pilots still pressed home attacks. Between 1943 and 1945, American forces lost approximately 400 B-25 seconds in combat across all theaters. Each aircraft represented 6 crew members. Approximately 2,400 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Strafer's firepower made it effective. It didn't make it safe. The psychological dimension of the Strafer's impact deserves careful examination because it represents a reversal that military theorists hadn't predicted. Bombers were supposed to be vulnerable. This was axiomatic in air combat doctrine developed during the interwar period and the war's early years. Fighters attacked bombers. Bombers defended themselves and relied on fighter escorts for protection. The relationship was predator and prey, with roles clearly defined. The B-25 Strafer disrupted this relationship fundamentally. It created a situation where bomber pilots actively engaged enemy fighters, where medium bombers hunted fighter aircraft, where the prey became predator. Luftwaffe combat reports from 1944 and 1945 show the doctrinal confusion this caused. German fighter pilots, particularly less experienced pilots replacing combat losses, encountered B-25 Strafer formations and attempted standard frontal attacks, only to find themselves facing firepower that exceeded their own aircraft's armament. The psychological impact was profound. A fighter pilot expected advantages in speed, maneuverability, and armament. Against a Strafer, 2 of those 3 advantages disappeared. The B-25 wasn't faster, but it didn't need to be. It wasn't. More maneuverable, but again, unnecessary. Its armament advantage was so overwhelming that many fighter pilots broke off attacks before reaching effective firing range. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who survived the war and whose combat reports are preserved in German military archives, described an encounter with B-25 Strafers over Italy in February 1945. I led my Schwarm 4 Bf-109G aircraft to intercept a reported formation of American bombers near Bologna. We identified 6 B-25 seconds at low altitude, apparently returning from a ground attack mission. I positioned myself for a standard frontal approach, intending to engage the lead bomber and break away. At 800 meters, the bomber opened fire. All my experience suggested this was premature. Bombers typically held fire until much closer range, but the volume of fire was extraordinary. Tracers filled the air between us. My number 2, Feldwebel Hartmann, took hits immediately. His engine began smoking. I broke left, abandoning the attack. We couldn't close to effective range against that firepower. Hartmann crashed 5 kilometers from the engagement site. He survived but was badly burned. Stigler's account is particularly valuable because he was an experienced pilot with over 400 combat missions. He wasn't a novice misidentifying the threat. His assessment was tactical and objective. Engaging B-25 Strafers from the front was unacceptably dangerous. This assessment spread through Luftwaffe fighter units as experienced pilots shared their experiences. By late 1944, Luftwaffe tactical manuals had been updated to recommend against frontal attacks on heavily armed American medium bombers, a designation that referred specifically to Strafer variants. The Japanese experience paralleled Germany's. IJN and IJA fighter units operating in the Southwest Pacific and Philippines encountered B-25 Strafers throughout 1943 and 1944. Japanese tactical doctrine, like German doctrine, emphasized frontal attacks against bombers. The Zero fighter, Japan's primary naval fighter, was lightly built and fast, but carried relatively light armament, 2 20mm cannons and 2 77mm machine guns in most variants. Against a Strafer's 8 or more 50 caliber guns, the Zero was outgunned and vulnerable. Japanese combat reports from this period describe American bombers as heavily armed or fighter-like in defensive capability. What made this psychological impact particularly significant was its cumulative effect. Early in the war, bomber crews were defensive. They flew formation, maintained discipline, and relied on mutual defensive fire. Fighter pilots could approach with reasonable confidence, accepting calculated risks. The Strafer reversed the psychological equation. Fighter pilots approaching Strafer formations faced not calculated risk but near certainty of encountering overwhelming fire. This created hesitation, caution, and in some documented cases, outright refusal to engage. German and Japanese fighter pilots were brave, this isn't questioned. But bravery has limits when tactical situations make success improbable and casualties near certain. Mission reports from German fighter units in Italy and France during late 1944 show increasing instances of fighters breaking off engagements with Strafer formations before reaching effective firing range. Some reports cite mechanical issues or fuel concerns, but the pattern suggests reluctance to press attacks against overwhelming firepower. This wasn't cowardice, it was a rational tactical assessment. A fighter pilot's duty was to intercept and destroy enemy aircraft. But if pressing the attack meant near certain loss of your own aircraft for uncertain probability of destroying the target, the tactical calculus didn't support engagement. Better to disengage, preserve your aircraft, and engage a different target under more favorable conditions. The strategic implications of this psychological shift were significant. If enemy fighters wouldn't engage straighter formations, those formations could operate with impunity at low altitude. This freed fighter escorts for other duties. It allowed Strafer squadrons to range deep into enemy territory without heavy protection, and it meant ground targets had fewer defenses available if fighters wouldn't engage the Strafers. Those targets depended entirely on anti-aircraft fire for protection. The B-25 Strafer, through overwhelming firepower and psychological dominance, had carved out a tactical niche where it operated as a predator with few natural threats. The technical evolution of the Strafer concept influenced post-war aircraft design in ways that remain visible in modern military aviation. The fundamental innovation mounting fixed, forward-firing guns in numbers that transformed the aircraft's role became doctrine for specialized attack aircraft. The Douglas A-26 Invader, which entered service in 1944, incorporated Strada principles from the design stage rather than as a field modification. It mounted 6 to 8 50 caliber guns in the nose and wings, plus gun pods carrying additional weapons. The A-26 served through Korea and Vietnam, remaining in active service for nearly 30 years. But the most direct lineage runs from Pappy Gunn's modified B-25 seconds to the AC-130 gunship and its successors. The AC-130, first deployed in Vietnam in the late 1960s, took the Strafer concept to its logical extreme. Mount overwhelming firepower on a stable platform, orbit the target, and deliver sustained fire with precision. Modern AC-130 variants mount 20mm Gatling guns, 40mm cannons, and 105mm howitzers. The tactical doctrine sustained fire support, suppression of ground defenses, precision engagement traces, directly to principles Gunn and his mechanics developed in dusty Pacific workshops during 1943. Paul Gunn continued flying combat missions throughout the war. His personnel file records over 200 combat sorties in multiple aircraft types. He survived the war without serious injury, remarkable, given his aggressive flying style and constant exposure to combat. On February 3, 1945, American forces liberated Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Gunn's wife and children, alive but weakened by 3 years of captivity, were freed. Gunn learned his family was safe on February 5th, when a telegram reached 5th Air Force headquarters. He'd spent 3 years fighting, inventing, and risking his life, driven by rage and hope in roughly equal measure. The hope was validated. His family survived. He remained in the Philippines after the war, working briefly for the new Philippine government before returning to the United States. The Army Air Forces awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and numerous other decorations. In citations, his superiors credited him with developing tactical innovations that saved countless American lives. General George Kenney, in his post-war memoir published in 1949, devoted an entire chapter to Gunn's modifications and their impact on 5th Air Force operations. Kenney wrote, "Pappy Gunn's Strafer modifications gave us offensive capability we desperately needed." His work transformed the B-25 from a vulnerable medium bomber into the most effective ground attack aircraft in the Pacific theater. I believe his innovations shortened the war in the Southwest Pacific by months. Gunn died in 1957, at age 57, from a heart attack. He was buried with military honors. News of his death received minimal press coverage. He wasn't famous. He'd never sought publicity. His innovations were credited to field modifications, or 5th Air Force engineering in most official histories. For decades, his name appeared primarily in specialist military aviation literature. Only in recent years, as historians examined maintenance records and personal accounts from Pacific Theater veterans, has Gunn's central role in developing the Strafer become widely recognized. The B-25 Strafer itself passed into history with surprising speed after the war. The aircraft that had dominated low-altitude combat from 1943 through 1945 was declared obsolete by 1948. Jets were the future. The B-25, with its reciprocating engines and World War II-era design, represented the past. Thousands were scrapped or sold as surplus. A few remained in service with Allied air forces through the 1950s. Some were converted for civilian use: cargo haulers, executive transports, fire bombers, but the Strafer variants, heavily modified and specialized, were mostly scrapped. Their armor was being removed, their excess guns stripped, their unique capabilities lost as the aircraft themselves disappeared. Yet the principles endured. The idea that overwhelming firepower could transform an aircraft's tactical role. The concept of mounting more guns than seemed reasonable or necessary. The willingness to question doctrine and modify equipment based on combat feedback rather than peacetime theory. These principles shaped post-war close air support doctrine. They influenced attack helicopter design in the 1960s and 70s. They informed the development of the A-10 Thunderbolt II, with its massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon, in the 1970s. The Strafer's legacy isn't the aircraft itself, but the tactical philosophy it represented. Adapt weapons to missions rather than forcing missions to fit available weapons. Looking back from our present perspective, 80 years after these events, the B-25 Strafer story reveals something fundamental about innovation during wartime. The innovation wasn't technological. The .50 caliber machine gun existed before Gunn started his modifications. The B-25 airframe existed. The tactical problem bomber vulnerability to frontal attacks was widely recognized. What Gunn provided wasn't new technology but new thinking. He questioned the assumption that bombers had to be vulnerable. He recognized that the same industrial capacity producing thousands of machine guns could provide overwhelming firepower if those guns were properly concentrated. And he had the practical mechanical skill to implement his ideas despite institutional resistance. This pattern repeated throughout World War II. The Manhattan Project didn't invent nuclear physics. It applied existing knowledge to create a weapon. Radar wasn't discovered during the war. It was refined and deployed widely. The proximity fuse, the bazooka, the Higgins boat, the Liberty ship, innovation after innovation came from applying existing technology in new ways or scaling production of proven designs. World War II wasn't won by science fiction weapons that didn't exist in 1939. It was won by taking what existed and using it better, faster, and in greater quantities than the enemy. The B-25 Strafer embodied this principle. It was a standard medium bomber, mass-produced by the thousands, modified with standard machine guns already in the supply system. The modification could be performed by competent mechanics in field workshops without specialized tools. The ammunition was standard .50 caliber, available from existing production. There was nothing exotic about the Strafer. What was extraordinary was the willingness to modify a bomber to perform like a fighter, to question the doctrinal assumption that bombers were inherently vulnerable to frontal attack, and to recognize that sometimes the solution to a tactical problem isn't a new weapon but a new way of using existing weapons. The Germans and Japanese could have developed similar modifications. They had capable bombers, effective guns, and talented engineers. They didn't, partly because their military cultures were less amenable to field modifications that challenged official doctrine, but also because they were fighting defensive campaigns where innovation was harder to implement and test. Innovation requires resources, time, and willingness to accept risk. By 1943, when the Strafer was developed, America had all three. Germany and Japan had none. They were fighting for survival, conserving resources, and couldn't afford expensive experiments that might fail. This asymmetry, American ability to innovate versus Axis inability to respond, compounded throughout the war. The Strafer was one example among hundreds. American forces could test modifications, adopt successful ones, standardize them in production, and deploy them in overwhelming numbers. German and Japanese forces could recognize the threat, write defensive, tactical, doctrine, and watch as their disadvantage grew wider. By 1945, this gap was unbridgeable. Germany and Japan faced enemies who could field weapons they couldn't counter, and who could innovate faster than they could respond. The morning of March 3, 1943, when squadron leader Okumura watched his wingman Zero disintegrate and barely escaped the same fate, represented a turning point. Not a strategic turning point, the war's outcome was already determined by industrial capacity and resource availability, but a tactical turning point, the moment when bomber crews stopped being inherently vulnerable prey and became hunters, the moment when fighter pilots had to calculate whether engaging bombers was worth the risk, the moment when Paul Gunn's anger and mechanical skill changed air combat doctrine in ways that rippled through decades of subsequent military aviation. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.